Richard had always believed that building a company was like shaping an extension of himself. He had poured every bit of energy and dedication into his venture, an electrical installation company he had seen grow almost like a child. Over time, his network of contacts and clients began to expand, and he started gaining recognition in the industry. Opportunities appeared more frequently, along with a desire to break into the European market. It was then that Dubois appeared, like a promise. The initial contact with Marc Dubois was casual, just a simple exchange of emails that soon evolved into deep conversations about business and opportunities. Marc, an experienced Belgian with ambitions that mirrored Richard's, quickly earned his admiration. Despite never having met in person, trust seemed to grow naturally. Dubois was well acquainted with the European market and proposed a promising collaboration. The idea of expanding his business internationally seemed increasingly real. When the invitation for a meeting finally arrived, Richard already felt ready to take this big step. Dubois suggested a meeting at an isolated hotel in the Ardennes woods, promising an experience that would blend business with leisure. The location seemed eccentric, but the potential for business made him ignore any warning signs. He knew that business involved risks, but he felt confident enough to take them. For him, this was the opportunity he had always awaited. As he packed his bag for what would be a business trip, Richard imagined the future possibilities and how they might transform his company. He already envisioned success, brand expansion, and new connections that would strengthen his empire. The excitement made him smile as he placed each item in his bag, unaware of the weight of the decision he was making. He was about to step out of his comfort zone, a move he had never made before, but curiosity and ambition spoke louder. Upon arriving at the airport, Richard replayed his conversations with Marc, almost convinced that nothing could go wrong. He meticulously planned each stage, believing nothing would be beyond his control. Dubois was a persuasive businessman, always a step ahead, but Richard saw this as an advantage. The future seemed bright and within reach. It was impossible to foresee the shadows beginning to gather, threatening everything he had built. As he boarded, he felt he was leaving more than just his country behind. He was temporarily abandoning the safety of familiar territory. The journey would be long, but for him, the destination marked the beginning of a new phase. Sitting on the plane, Richard closed his eyes for a moment, hoping this would be the right decision. He was headed towards something that would soon prove to be much more than a simple business meeting. In the midst of conversations with Dubois, Richard started noticing nuances that had previously escaped him. The casual tone Dubois used to describe his associates had an oddness that was hard to ignore. There was something dark and unsettling in the way he spoke about these people. Richard sensed that these colleagues seemed more like a faction than business partners. Something bothered him, but ambition drowned out any impulse to hesitate. Although his intuition warned him, Richard didn't want to give in to fear. He remembered that great opportunities required sacrifices and risks. There was no room for hesitation or insecurity in business. Determined to ignore what he called baseless impressions, he prepared himself to trust Dubois. But each time he thought about the meeting and the mysterious partners, his discomfort grew. In their final conversation before the trip, Dubois mentioned that the meeting would take place in a special and secluded location, far from prying eyes. Richard tried to see this as a strategy to maintain business confidentiality. However, the way Dubois insisted on this idea seemed exaggerated. He began to question what was really happening in that isolated place. But he dismissed these thoughts as if they were unfounded illusions. Arriving in Dinant brought an increasing sense of unease. The surrounding woods were dense and mysterious, more like the setting of an old tale than a business meeting. Richard observed the hotel from afar, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Deep down, he knew something was wrong, but the distance from home and the effort he had made kept him from turning back. Upon entering the hotel, he felt he was stepping into unknown, perhaps even dangerous, territory. But the thought of his company and potential growth made him ignore these feelings. He tried to convince himself that it was just paranoia, that his instincts were confused with anxiety. Thus, Richard decided to move forward, pretending everything was fine. At the reception, seeing Dubois with a mysterious smile, his suspicion momentarily dissipated. Marc continued to be his cordial, welcoming self, acting as the perfect host. But as he walked through the dark, silent corridors, Richard felt the shadow of doubt following him. He forced himself to focus on his objective, but fear had already settled in his subconscious, waiting to be awakened. The first time he saw Marc Dubois in person, Richard was surprised by his sophisticated appearance. Du Bois exuded a natural elegance, and there was something in his gaze that radiated self-confidence. When he extended his hand to greet him, Richard felt an unexpected sense of familiarity. Du Bois seemed like an old friend, someone he could trust. This calmed him, and the trip continued on a note of camaraderie. During the journey, Du Bois shared details about his life and business. He spoke with an enchanting fluency, as if each word had been meticulously chosen. Richard, who had always been skeptical, found himself inclined to believe every statement Du Bois made. There was a confidence in that voice that made him question any lingering doubt. Du Bois spoke about the future with a contagious conviction. Du Bois also showed genuine interest in Richard's life, asking about his business journey. Richard found himself speaking sincerely, as if he were talking to a close friend. This level of interest and the caring way Du Bois listened to his stories further dismantled any lingering suspicion. Richard began to feel fortunate for this partnership and grew eager for what awaited him. However, there was a moment when Du Bois's charm seemed to falter. When Richard asked about the other associates, Mark showed a slight hesitation, an almost imperceptible pause. It was only a moment, but enough to intrigue Richard. Still, Du Bois quickly recovered, assuring him that his colleagues were of utmost trust. Once again, Richard ignored the warning sign. Upon arriving in Dinant, Du Bois resumed his friendly demeanor, attending to details and helping Richard feel at home. Richard tried to stay grounded, remembering that Du Bois was, after all, a businessman like himself. But gradually, the sense that Du Bois knew more than he was letting on began to disturb him. Something seemed hidden behind that friendly smile. Despite these doubts, Richard tried hard not to judge prematurely. He was there for a clear objective, and he needed to trust his partner to achieve it. The contradictory feelings Du Bois stirred in Richard left him tense, but at the same time intrigued. After all, he thought, big business ventures are always cloaked in secrecy and mystery, trying to convince himself. The hotel where they would be staying looked like something out of another century. From a distance, Richard could see the large two-story structure surrounded by a dense, dark forest. The facade was partially worn by time, with dusty windows and an unkempt garden, enhancing the feeling of abandonment. Du Bois, however, seemed oblivious to the grim surroundings, acting with a disconcerting calm, as if perfectly at home. Upon entering, Richard noticed that the interior of the hotel was even stranger than its exterior. The main lobby was vast, with walls covered in ancient tapestries and heavy, dark wood furniture. Candlelit chandeliers cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating a dance of light around him. Every detail of the place seemed antiquated and decadent, as if the atmosphere itself were steeped in old secrets. Du Bois guided Richard down a long corridor to the second floor, where his room would be. Each step made the wooden floor creak, echoing through the empty hallway, a sound he found disturbing. Upon reaching the room, Du Bois handed him a curious key, heavy and ornate, and with a smile, said the place was completely reserved just for them. Richard smiled, but a feeling of distrust began to creep into his mind. As soon as Du Bois said his goodbyes and left him alone, Richard approached the room's window and looked out at the forest. The view was beautiful, but something about the vastness weighed on him. It felt as if nature itself was closing in around him, creating a sense of absolute isolation. That night, while trying to relax and sleep, Richard noticed that the silence was so profound it became oppressive. Every little sound seemed amplified, as if something, or someone, were lurking in the hallway. Before going to bed, he decided to explore the room in search of something to distract him from the growing unease. In the drawers, he found an old leather-bound book with no title. Opening it, he encountered pages covered with strange symbols and words in an unknown language. This made him feel even more uncomfortable, but at the same time, a morbid curiosity kept him flipping through the pages. After a few minutes, he closed the book and put it away, trying to dismiss any thoughts it had stirred. In the first few minutes in bed, Richard tossed and turned, unable to close his eyes. He felt that something was wrong in that place, though he didn't know exactly what. When he finally managed to sleep, he had a strange dream. He was walking down the same corridor, but something invisible was pulling him toward the end, to a door that seemed to appear out of nowhere. He woke up in a cold sweat, convinced that it was more than just a simple nightmare. Richard awoke suddenly in the middle of the night, his heart racing and a chilling cold running down his spine. He felt his body paralyzed for a few seconds, as if some invisible presence was there, watching him in the dark. He tried to shake off the fear, convincing himself it was just the nervousness of the trip and the strange atmosphere of the hotel. However, when he closed his eyes again, he heard a distant whisper coming from the hallway. Curiosity, mixed with fear, led him out of bed to open the door, peering into the dimly lit corridor. Candlelight cast shadows on the walls, and the whisper seemed to echo from afar, barely audible but present. He felt ridiculous for spying into the corridor like a child, yet he couldn't shake the sense that something was there. He took a few steps toward the end of the corridor, where the darkness was thicker, and then he heard another sound. This sound was different, like faint voices speaking in a language he didn't understand, something ancient and disturbing. He felt the hairs on his arms stand up and decided to return to his room, convincing himself that it was all just his imagination. Before closing the door, he took one last look at the corridor and swore he saw a shadow moving in the dimness, too fast to be identified. Fear began to intensify. Upon returning to bed, Richard could no longer sleep. The image of the moving shadow and the persistent whisper imprinted themselves on his mind as an uncomfortable memory. He wondered why Du Bois was so insistent on that isolated, gloomy place. As much as he tried to calm himself, part of his subconscious seemed to be warning him of something. The anxiety he felt only increased with each second of silence. Lying there, he replayed every detail of his conversation with Du Bois, searching for any clues that could justify the discomfort he now felt. As much as he tried to rationalize, there was a dark certainty that something was about to happen. That night, Richard barely slept, waking several times to visions of shadows and footsteps in the corridor. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, and he could hardly wait for the dawn to bring some light to dispel his fears. With the first ray of sunlight, he felt relieved, though the unease lingered. He decided that in the morning, he would confront Du Bois about the meeting and the reason for such a peculiar location for a business gathering. There was something he needed to understand, though part of him feared discovering the answer. At that moment, Richard already sensed that something sinister was at play. He just didn't yet grasp the depth of the nightmare he had stumbled into. The following evening, Richard went down to dinner, where Du Bois introduced him to other men and women from his inner circle. They were all impeccably dressed, with formal attire and calculated gestures that made them seem more like characters in a play. The formality was oppressive, and the silence between words made the atmosphere feel even heavier. Richard sensed that each smile was a mask, concealing secrets he would rather not uncover. As the dinner went on, he noticed that everyone present seemed to know him in some way. They asked subtle questions about his company, his past, and the entire time, carefully avoided sharing any personal details about themselves. Richard realized that he was the only one speaking about himself, while the others watched him with expressionless faces, as if analyzing each of his words. The feeling of being judged by unknown eyes grew more intense. During a moment of silence, Du Bois commented that the meeting with the true associates would take place later that night, and that Richard should be prepared. Du Bois's tone was cold, almost mechanical, and the guests' gazes grew more intense. Richard felt a chill down his spine, and a sense of alarm gripped him. Something wasn't right, and he was beginning to realize he might be in danger. The other guests also seemed impatient, exchanging furtive glances and whispering words in languages he didn't recognize. Suddenly, Richard felt as though he was not truly welcome, merely tolerated at that table. Looking around, he felt surrounded by ambiguous figures, as if each person had a specific role to play that night. This was no ordinary dinner. It was a veiled ritual, and he was the only one unaware of what was happening. Time dragged on, and despite his efforts to relax, the tension grew with each passing moment. Richard no longer knew if he should stay and try to understand Du Bois's plans or flee as quickly as possible. But curiosity held him there, along with a feeling that he needed to prove himself in that hostile environment. He felt that any misstep could cost him dearly. When the meal finally ended, everyone rose, and Du Bois invited him to follow them to a room at the back of the hotel. With a churning stomach and heightened senses, Richard had no choice but to accompany them, though a voice in his mind begged him to run. With hesitant steps, he followed the group down the dark corridor, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. Once they settled in the back room, Richard noticed that the setting was unlike anything he had experienced before. The walls were adorned with old paintings of dark, almost ghostly figures who seemed to observe them in silence. On the center table, there was a tray with crystal glasses and a bottle of wine in a disturbingly dark hue. Du Bois served the drink to the guests, including Richard, all the while keeping his eyes fixed on him. The conversation continued in low tones, almost whispered, with everyone exchanging looks of complicity and muted laughter. Richard felt like an intruder, a stranger in a ritual where everyone knew exactly what to do. accept him. Even so, he took a sip of the wine, trying to blend in and appear relaxed. But he soon noticed that the taste was strange, bitter, different from what he expected. His lips began to tingle, and a slight dizziness overcame him. Within seconds, Richard felt his body weaken, as if an irresistible wave of drowsiness was overtaking him. He tried to stay upright, but his body felt 3 times heavier with each passing moment. He looked to Dubois, hoping for a reaction, but the Belgian merely watched, expressionless, with a faint smile on his lips. It was as if he were waiting for something to happen, like a patient spectator awaiting the climax of a show. Desperate, Richard tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond. His hands felt cold, and cold sweat trickled down his forehead. The room spun around him, and each guest's face distorted into shadows and mocking smiles. The last thing he saw before collapsing was Dubois leaning over him, whispering something in French that Richard barely understood, but that sounded like a sinister farewell. As he fell, Richard noticed the cold, calculating stares of each person in the room, all in silence, watching him lose consciousness completely. The floor seemed to absorb his energy, and he felt himself sinking into a thick, heavy darkness, as if the hotel itself were swallowing him whole. In his final moments of lucidity, he felt a mix of horror and helplessness, unable to grasp what was truly happening. Darkness took over, and Richard lost all awareness. His body was moved, dragged to some unknown place, while voices around him murmured indecipherable chants. His mind drifted between dreams and nightmares, and he had only a vague notion that something far worse awaited him. In that moment, his life as a businessman and a man of the world had been erased, and he found himself at the mercy of forces he didn't understand. When he regained consciousness, Richard felt the chill of dawn against his skin. He was lying on damp ground, surrounded by a metallic, heavy smell that made him shiver. Opening his eyes, he was met with the most horrifying sight he had ever witnessed. In front of him stood a rustic table covered in ritual objects, statuettes, sharp tools, and lit candles casting a ghostly light on the scene. He felt like a prisoner trapped in a nightmare. But the worst part was around the table. Human skulls, some still with bits of flesh, formed a macabre circle. Mutilated bodies lay meticulously arranged, like offerings prepared for some kind of ceremony. Richard tried to move, but a searing pain shot through his hands. Looking at them, he realized his ring fingers were missing, severed, with fresh blood still oozing from the wounds. As the horror of the situation settled in, he became aware that he was not alone. Across the circle, hooded figures dressed in dark robes chanted in deep, strange tones, a low, unsettling melody that seemed to pierce his soul. At the center of the group, a more imposing figure stood in silence, observing everything. When Richard focused, he saw, to his horror, that it was Marc Dubois. Dubois's gaze now held a mix of triumph and coldness, with none of the friendly warmth he had known. Noticing that Richard was awake, he raised a hand and began chanting words in an unknown language that sounded more like curses. Each of Dubois's words made the atmosphere feel heavier, the air thicker. Paralyzed by fear, Richard realized this was a ritual, and he was at its very center. The sudden understanding of what was happening pushed him beyond despair. He was an offering, a piece in some kind of dark ceremony. The hooded figures began to approach, their steps synchronized as if they were one body moving with precision. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, praying that it wasn't real, that he would wake up safe in his bed, but reality was merciless. Desperate, Richard gathered every bit of strength he had and stood up, stumbling as he realized his body was still partially numb. In a burst of adrenaline, he began to run, tripping over roots and rocks as the chants of the hooded figures faded into the distance. He ran as he had never run before, his vision blurred and his heart pounding, knowing that this could be his last act of freedom. He knew that if he stopped, he would be lost forever. As he ran through the dark forest, Richard heard the heavy footsteps of his pursuers drawing closer. The sensation of being hunted put his body on high alert, and every muscle ached from the effort to flee. He knew any misstep could be fatal, but his mind remained focused on a single goal: survival. Behind him, the hooded figures' voices echoed among the trees, blending with the rustling leaves and the cold wind. Richard looked back and, in the darkness, glimpsed Dubois standing still, watching him from afar. The Belgian's expression was a mix of anger and determination, like a hunter unwilling to let his prey escape. He looked certain that Richard had nowhere to run. Panic overtook Richard as he realized this was no ordinary chase. He needed to find a safe place, some shelter to escape the reach of these men. In a desperate moment, he saw the staircase of the hotel he had noticed before and climbed up, re-entering through a window. Inside, the hotel was eerily quiet, and he could scarcely believe he had temporarily escaped. Stumbling down the hallway, Richard reached his room and locked the door, breathing heavily. The silence, however, felt threatening, as though even the building itself were watching his attempt to flee. After a few moments to recover, he realized he had to get out by any means necessary. He quickly gathered his belongings, grabbed a few documents, and prepared to leave through the front door. Before leaving, he glanced one last time down the dark hallway and had the distinct feeling someone was watching him. It was as if Du Bois and his followers lingered in every shadow, ready to pull him back into that nightmare. He would need to be quick and cautious. Leaving the hotel, Richard took a different route than the one he had used to arrive. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him. Every sound made him flinch. The feeling of being pursued was intense, but he knew his only chance of escaping was to keep moving. Even with exhaustion overtaking him, he didn't allow himself to stop. Survival was all he could think of in that moment. After a long and exhausting journey, he finally saw the lights of the town of Dinant. Without hesitation, he headed to the local police station, where he was received by the on-duty officer. Exhausted and with his heart still pounding, Richard tried to explain what had happened, though he knew that this terrifying experience would follow him for the rest of his life. Looking back, he felt the danger hadn't truly passed. Du Bois's cult was still out there, lurking somewhere in the shadows. Victor Desmet, the officer who attended to Richard at the station, wore a serious, cautious expression. He helped Richard calm down, offering him a glass of water and asking him to breathe deeply. Gradually, Richard began to recount, in a trembling voice, the details of the ritual, the hooded figures, and Marc Du Bois himself. Desmet listened in silence, though as Richard continued, the officer's expression grew increasingly somber. When Richard finished, Victor let out a long sigh, as if he had been expecting something like this all along. He confided that rumors of secret cults in the Ardennes, of societies operating in the shadows, far from the law's reach, had persisted for many years. "These people have power everywhere," murmured Desmet in an almost inaudible tone. Richard felt a chill as he realized that perhaps no one could truly protect him from them. For Desmet, investigating these matters meant risking his own life. "If you want my advice, leave and never speak of this to anyone," Desmet warned, his face impassive. He explained that this cult wasn't just a group of mysticism enthusiasts, but an influential society made up of powerful individuals. These were people capable of silencing anyone who threatened them, and they wouldn't hesitate to do the same to Richard if he decided to pursue the matter. The officer's words made Richard's fear intensify. As Desmet spoke, Richard felt overwhelmed by helplessness. He had just escaped a nightmare alive, yet the threat was far from over. The officer's words echoed in his mind, and he realized his only option was to take the advice seriously. Desmet offered him shelter at the station for the night, though he made it clear that Richard would have to leave the next day and never return to Dinant. That night, Richard could barely sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he relived images of the ritual, Du Bois's cold gaze, and the hooded figures surrounding him. He felt that somehow he was still being watched, even there within the safety of the police station. The trauma and exhaustion made the night a silent torment, and he could only hope for morning to come, so he could escape that place for good. The following morning, Desmet said goodbye with a firm handshake and a final warning. "These people never forget, Mr. Gomez. Do whatever it takes to disappear." Richard left without looking back, carrying the weight of Desmet's warnings and the certainty that the experience would leave deep, indelible marks on his life. The nightmare had ended, but the shadows of Dinant would haunt him forever. Returning to Spain, Richard tried to return to his routine, believing the worst was behind him. But as the days passed, he realized the Ardennes nightmares had left a deeper mark than he had anticipated. His once thriving business began to crumble, as if something invisible were eating away at everything he had built. His clients began canceling contracts without explanation, leaving him completely disoriented. Each time he tried to rebuild his company, a new obstacle would arise. Strange rumors circulated among his clients, hinting that Richard was untrustworthy, though he had no idea where this information originated. He tried reaching out to old business allies, but they responded with silence and distrust. Over time, the company he had built with so much effort was reduced to ruins, driving him to the brink of despair. Then the calls began. Initially, Richard thought they were just prank calls, but he soon realized the threatening tone behind them. Unknown voices, always in the same cold tone, warned him to give up, to forget what he had seen. Sometimes, it was just the sound of deep, muffled breathing that froze his blood, making him relive the horror of that night. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if they were everywhere, surrounding him. As days passed, Richard began to suspect that anyone around him could be a threat. He avoided contact with acquaintances, even family, fearing something might happen to them. His world became a dark, oppressive place, where every unfamiliar face stirred the fear of an ambush, of Du Bois and his followers coming to settle the score. Paranoia infiltrated every part of his life, turning him into a prisoner of his own fear. He tried seeking professional help, but the thought of sharing his story with anyone felt too risky. What if the cult had infiltrated those who were supposed to help him? Richard found himself in a dead end, where silence was his only option for survival. He no longer slept well, barely ate. His life had become a constant vigil, where fear had replaced any trace of normalcy. The last straw came when one of his few remaining clients warned him about a series of rumors circulating in the market. Richard realized that someone was destroying his reputation with frightening efficiency. Unable to resist any longer, he knew his only choice was to shut down and disappear. Thus, he began planning his escape, abandoning everything he had built with the goal of leaving behind his own identity and everything he once was. Richard closed his business and rid himself of everything he had in Valencia. Within weeks, he had sold the office, the stock, and even his apartment, carrying only the weight in his heart and an emptiness only he could understand. With what little he had left, he decided to start over somewhere no one knew him, where he might be able to rebuild his life far from the shadows. Murcia seemed like a safe choice, a city where he could blend in unnoticed. The move was a painful process. Richard cut ties with all friends and family, severing any link that could identify him. He changed his phone number and avoided contact with old acquaintances. He began using a false name, as if it could push away the past and erase what he had experienced in Belgium. Solitude became his new companion, and fear was the only certainty in his new life. Richard chose a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, where he limited his comings and goings to avoid attention. He avoided long conversations with neighbors, always maintaining a discreet and cautious demeanor. Within a few months, he was nearly invisible, which made him feel slightly safer. He forced himself to believe that the less attention he attracted, the fewer chances there were of the cult finding him. Still, every unexpected noise, every letter without a return address made him relive the feeling of being hunted. Paranoia had taken root in his mind, like a shadow that followed him everywhere. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced someone was outside. The terror of the Ardennes had scarred him forever, and he was constantly trying to escape something that would never leave him in peace. Even in Murcia, where no one knew who he was, Richard felt pursued. He had become a suspicious man, avoiding any form of friendship or attachment. He knew anyone could be an informant, that Du Bois and his cult could find him at any moment. Isolation and the constant sense of being watched drained his energy, but he saw no other option to stay alive. So Richard began to live almost like a ghost, a man who wandered through his days without identity or purpose. The life he had once known had completely dissolved, and now his future was only an extension of the fear he carried in his chest. He had left everything behind, yet he knew the threat of those who hunted him would never truly disappear. With time, Richard came to accept he would never fully escape what he had experienced. He lived in constant fear of being discovered, that some trace of his former life would be enough to bring them back. Each time he left the house, he looked over his shoulder, convinced that Du Bois's men could be lurking nearby. He had learned to coexist with paranoia, though he knew the weight of that secret would consume him until the end. Every week, Richard changed his habits to ensure he wasn't being followed. He avoided any form of public record, paid for everything in cash, wore neutral clothes, and avoided visiting the same places repeatedly. His life became a constant dance of precautions, as if each misstep could expose him. He had become a shadow of himself, a figure moving through places without leaving a trace. Despite the passing time, his fear didn't fade. Richard knew that as long as he lived, he would be a hunted man. Reading news about mysterious disappearances and secret societies only reminded him of his vulnerability. And though he tried to ignore these signs, a part of him knew that Du Bois and his cult were somewhere, always watching for any move he might make. The isolation brought a profound sense of desolation, a sadness he could barely hide. He was no longer the confident man he once had been, but someone surviving on the fringes, consumed by fear and the weight of the secret he carried. He had lost everything: his company, his friends, his family, and most of all, his peace of mind. Now he was a man torn between past and present, living in a dark limbo. On the rare occasions he managed to sleep, His nightmares returned him to the Ardennes, to the hotel and the ritual, reliving each detail of that night of terror. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, and look around, fearing to see Dubois's hooded figure. His life had become a prison, an endless cycle of dread and paranoia that he knew would never end. Richard understood that no matter how well he hid, he would never truly be safe. The experience in the Ardennes had left invisible but deep scars that he would carry forever. He had learned the hard way that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And so he accepted that his new reality was this, an eternal exile, haunted by the shadow of a cult he could never truly escape.